Picture this: a company so dominant that its name becomes a verb, so powerful that competitors seem irrelevant, so confident in its position that the future feels like a certainty rather than a question. Then, in what feels like a blink of cosmic time, it's gone. Not wounded, not weakened, but erased. The buildings remain, the logos fade, the customers move on, and the world forgets that this giant ever ruled at all. This is not a story about bad luck. It's not about economic crashes, natural disasters, or unforeseeable catastrophes. This is about something far more terrifying, something that every leader, every entrepreneur, every person building something meaningful should fear more than any external threat. This is about the enemy that lives inside success itself, the quiet killer that waits patiently in boardrooms, in quarterly reports, in the applause of shareholders. It's called comfort. And comfort, when mixed with power, creates a poison that has destroyed more empires than any competitor ever could. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, we're going to walk through the ruins of giants. We'll stand in the empty offices of companies that once seemed immortal. We'll trace the moments, the decisions, the tiny cracks that became canyons. These are not tales of villains or fools. These are stories of intelligent people, brilliant minds, who simply stopped asking the most dangerous question in business. What if we're wrong? The companies we'll explore tonight didn't fail because they lacked resources. They had billions. They didn't fail because they lacked talent. They employed the brightest minds in their industries. They didn't fail because they lacked market position. They were the markets. They failed because they believed their own stories. They failed because yesterday's victory became today's strategy. They failed because the very success that built them created the blindness that destroyed them. From Kodak, who invented digital photography then refused to embrace it, to Blockbuster, who laughed at a startup called Netflix offering to sell for $50 million, to Nokia, who ruled the mobile world until they didn't, to BlackBerry, who thought physical keyboards would always matter. These weren't small mistakes. These were billion-dollar lessons written in the disappearing ink of corporate history. What makes these stories so haunting, so eerily relevant even now, is that the pattern repeats. Different industries, different decades, different technologies, but the same fundamental error. The mistake of believing that dominance today guarantees relevance tomorrow. The mistake of confusing what worked yesterday with what will work next. The mistake of building walls around yesterday's fortress while the battlefield quietly shifts to entirely new ground. As we move through these stories, you'll notice something unsettling. The signs were always there. The warnings came early. The data contradicted the comfortable narrative. But in each case, the organization chose certainty over curiosity, chose protection over adaptation, chose the past over the future. Not because they were stupid, but because they were human. And humans, especially successful humans, prefer the known over the unknown, the proven over the experimental, the comfortable over the uncomfortable. The business world likes to celebrate disruption, to praise innovation, to reward the bold. But what we rarely discuss is the cost of staying still, the price of comfort, the toll that complacency extracts, not in dramatic moments, but in thousands of small decisions that seem reasonable at the time, the meetings where concerns were dismissed, the memos that were ignored, the competitors that were underestimated, the technologies that were labeled as toys, the customers whose changing preferences were treated as noise rather than signal. These stories matter because they're not history, they're prophecy. Right now, in boardrooms across the world, leaders are making the same mistakes. Different products, different markets, different names, but the same fundamental error. They're building strategies on the assumption that their current position is permanent, They're investing in defending what exists rather than creating what's next. They're listening to the voices that confirm their beliefs rather than the ones that challenge them. Tonight's journey is not meant to judge. It's meant to illuminate, to show how easily confidence becomes arrogance, how quickly leadership becomes isolation, how subtly vision becomes blindness. These companies didn't wake up one morning and decide to fail. They made reasonable choices based on reasonable assumptions using reasonable data. And that's exactly what makes their stories so instructive and so terrifying. The graveyard of business history is filled with companies that were too big to fail, until they failed, too powerful to ignore, until they were forgotten, too smart to be disrupted, until disruption arrived. And the most expensive lesson of all, the one written in billions of lost dollars and millions of lost jobs and countless lost opportunities, is this: no position is permanent, no advantage is forever, no company is immune to the simple, savage math of relevance. Stay relevant or become a case study, so settle in. Let your breathing slow, allow your mind to drift. Through these cautionary tales, these expensive lessons, these monuments to the most dangerous assumption in business, that success is a destination rather than a constant process of reinvention. The stories we're about to explore cost billions to learn, but they're yours tonight for free. All you have to do is listen, absorb, and remember. Because the best way to avoid repeating history is to study it while everyone else is sleeping. Let's begin with a company that, quite literally, captured the world. Kodak, the invention they buried. In 1975, inside a laboratory at Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, New York, an engineer named Stephen Sasson built something revolutionary. It was ugly, clunky, primitive. It weighed 8 pounds. It recorded images onto a cassette tape. It took 23 seconds to capture a single black and white photograph at a resolution of 0.01 megapixels. By any measure, it was an imperfect prototype, a crude proof of concept, a toy. It was also the world's first digital camera, and Kodak owned it completely. Stephen Sasson demonstrated his invention to Kodak executives, walking them through the technology, explaining the implications, showing them the future. The response was not enthusiasm, it was concern. Not about whether the technology would work, that was obvious. The concern was about what it would do to their existing business. And their existing business was very, very good. At that time, Kodak was not just a company, it was an institution. It was synonymous with photography itself. Kodak Moment wasn't marketing language, it was cultural vocabulary. The company controlled roughly 90% of film sales in America and 85% of camera sales. Its yellow boxes were in every pharmacy, every supermarket, every corner store. Its brand was trusted, beloved, dominant. The profit model was elegant and addictive. Sell the cameras cheaply, make the real money on film and developing. It was the razor and blade model perfected. And it generated extraordinary margins. Film was cheap to make and expensive to buy. Developing was a chemical process that required specialized equipment and created ongoing revenue. The entire system was designed to create customer dependency and recurring income. Kodak's executives looked at Stephen Sasson's digital camera and saw a threat to this perfect machine. If photography went digital, there would be no film to sell, no chemicals to buy, no developing to charge for. The entire profit engine would evaporate, so they made a choice. They classified the technology. They buried the prototype. They continued investing in film. This wasn't ignorance. Kodak's leadership understood the technology perfectly. They had invented it. This was calculation. They believed they could control the pace of change. They believed they could manage the transition. They believed their market position gave them the luxury of time. They were wrong on all counts. While Kodak protected its film business, the world began changing around them. Other companies, unburdened by profitable legacy systems, started exploring digital imaging. Sony introduced the Mavica in 1981. Canon, Nikon, and others followed. None of these early digital cameras were good enough to threaten film. Not yet. But they were improving, and more importantly, they were training a generation of engineers, building expertise, establishing positions in a market that Kodak had invented but refused to enter. Kodak did eventually respond. In the 1990s, they released digital cameras. Some were quite good, but they approached the market with deep ambivalence, never fully committing, always protecting the film business, always trying to have it both ways. They wanted to sell digital cameras that didn't cannibalize film sales. They wanted to participate in the future while preserving the past. They wanted transformation without disruption. The fatal flaw wasn't technological. Kodak had the patents, the talent, the resources. The fatal flaw was strategic. They optimized for quarterly earnings rather than long-term position. They prioritized protecting existing profits over building future ones. They made decisions based on what their business model needed rather than what their customers wanted. As digital photography improved, the film business didn't gradually decline. It collapsed. Between 2000 and 2003, Kodak's revenues from traditional photography fell by over 30%. The company that had ruled photography for over a century suddenly found itself irrelevant in a digital world it had invented, but refused to lead. Kodak filed for bankruptcy in January 2012. At its peak, the company had employed over 140,000 people. It held more patents than almost any company in America. It had cash reserves in the billions. None of it mattered. They had invented the future and then spent decades running from it. The lesson isn't about technology. It's about the trap of profitability. Kodak's film business was so lucrative that it became impossible to abandon, even when the future made abandonment inevitable. They couldn't kill their golden goose, so the market did it for them. But by then they had lost the time and position to build a replacement. This is the pattern we'll see again and again tonight. Companies that see the future clearly but choose the past anyway. Not because they're blind, but because they're captured. Captured by quarterly pressures, by investor expectations, by organizational inertia, by the sheer gravitational pull of existing success. Kodak's story is a reminder that invention alone means nothing. Execution is everything. And execution requires the willingness to disrupt yourself before someone else does it for you. It requires the courage to cannibalize profitable businesses before they become unprofitable. It requires understanding that the greatest risk isn't moving too fast, it's moving too slow. The digital camera that Steven Sasson built in 1975 sits in a museum now, a monument to the future that Kodak could have owned. A reminder that seeing the future and choosing the future are very different things, and sometimes the most expensive mistake is having the right answer and ignoring it anyway. Blockbuster. The $50 million mistake. In the year 2000, a small startup called Netflix was struggling. The company had launched 3 years earlier with a simple idea. Rent DVDs through the mail, no late fees, keep them as long as you want. It was elegant but expensive. The postage costs were high. Customer acquisition was slow. The dot-com bubble was bursting. Venture capital was drying up. Netflix was burning cash and running out of runway. So the founders, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph, did what struggling startups do. They went looking for a buyer, and they found what seemed like a perfect match: Blockbuster Video, the undisputed king of movie rentals, with over 9,000 stores worldwide and millions of loyal customers walking through their doors every week. The Netflix team flew to Dallas to meet with Blockbuster's leadership. They pitched a partnership. Blockbuster would promote Netflix in their stores. Netflix would run Blockbuster's online presence. It was a complementary fit. Blockbuster had the brand and the customers. Netflix had the technology and the logistics. Together, they could own the entire movie rental market, physical and digital. The asking price for the partnership was $50 million. Not for the whole company, just for a significant stake. $50 million to acquire the technology, the expertise, the platform that would eventually grow into a company worth over $150 billion. Blockbuster's CEO, John Antioco, and his team listened politely. Then they laughed. Not metaphorically. Literally laughed at the Netflix founders. The idea of paying $50 million for a money-losing DVD by mail service seemed absurd. Blockbuster was making billions. Their stores were printing money. Why would they need Netflix? This wasn't arrogance born of ignorance. Blockbuster's leadership understood their business deeply. They had $6 billion in revenue. They had nearly 60,000 employees. They had a brand that was recognized globally. And most importantly, they had a profit model that seemed indestructible. That profit model was built on a simple premise: late fees. Customers would rent movies, forget to return them on time, and pay penalties that often exceeded the original rental cost. Industry estimates suggested that late fees accounted for a massive portion of Blockbuster's profits. Some analyses put it as high as 16% of total revenue. It was pure margin, requiring no additional inventory, no extra labor, just automated penalties on forgetful customers. Netflix's entire value proposition attacked this model directly. No late fees. Keep movies as long as you want. Return them when you're ready. It was customer-friendly, but seemingly unprofitable. How could a business survive without penalty revenue? How could margins work when postage costs ate into every transaction? Blockbuster's leadership looked at Netflix's model and saw a charity, not a competitor. What they missed was the shifting ground beneath their feet. The late fees that drove Blockbuster's profits also drove customer resentment. People hated late fees. They felt manipulated, punished for the crime of being busy or forgetful. Netflix wasn't just offering convenience. They were offering dignity. They were treating customers like adults rather than revenue sources to be penalized. Blockbuster also missed the technology trajectory. In 2000, streaming wasn't viable yet. Internet speeds were too slow, compression wasn't good enough. But anyone paying attention to technology trends could see where it was heading. Bandwidth was increasing. Storage was getting cheaper. Within a decade, maybe less, streaming would be possible. And when it became possible, the company with the customer relationships, the recommendation algorithms, and the content expertise would own the market. After the rejection, Netflix went back to Silicon Valley and did what all great companies do when faced with existential crisis. They adapted. They raised more money. They refined their model. They invested heavily in technology and logistics. They built recommendation systems that helped customers discover movies they didn't know they wanted. They created a seamless experience that made Blockbuster's model feel increasingly dated. Meanwhile, Blockbuster continued optimizing the video rental store. They experimented with ending late fees in 2005, a desperate attempt to compete with Netflix's customer-friendly model. But the move cost them hundreds of millions in lost revenue and confused their franchise owners, many of whom relied on late fee income. They reversed course, then tried again, creating organizational whiplash. By 2007, Netflix had over 7 million subscribers. Blockbuster launched their own mail service and online platform, trying to catch up. But they were playing catch-up in a game they could have owned. They were the follower, not the leader. Their stores, once an unbeatable advantage, became an albatross. High rents, labor costs, inventory expenses. All the fixed costs that made the business profitable in good times made it fragile when the market shifted. Then Netflix made their next move. In 2007, they launched streaming. Initially, it was a small addition to the mail service, almost an experiment. The catalogue was limited, the quality was imperfect, but the direction was clear. The future wasn't about mailing DVDs or driving to stores. The future was instant access, unlimited selection, no waiting. Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy in September 2010. At its peak, the company was worth over $5 billion. By the end, it was worth essentially nothing. The brand was sold off, the stores were closed, the employees lost their jobs, and Netflix, the company Blockbuster could have bought for $50 million, became one of the most valuable media companies in the world. The cost of Blockbuster's mistake wasn't just $50 million. It was the entire future of entertainment distribution. It was billions in market value. It was thousands of jobs. It was a complete and total transfer of power, from an established giant to a hungry upstart. What makes this story particularly painful is that Blockbuster had every advantage. They had the customers, they had the cash, they had the brand recognition. They could have bought Netflix, integrated the technology, and used their stores as distribution centers for the mail service while building the streaming platform. They could have owned both the present and the future. Instead, they chose comfort. They chose the familiar over the uncertain. They chose protecting quarterly earnings over building long-term position. They optimized for today's profits and ignored tomorrow's threats until tomorrow became today, and the threats became existential. The lesson from Blockbuster isn't subtle. When someone shows you the future, even if it looks small and unprofitable, pay attention. When a business model attacks your most vulnerable point, your customer's biggest pain, take it seriously. When technology trends suggest disruption is coming, don't wait for it to arrive. Build it yourself, or buy it from someone else. Because the cost of moving too late isn't just the acquisition price, it's everything. Blockbuster rejected Netflix because they couldn't imagine a world without late fees, without physical stores, without the model that had made them successful. And that failure of imagination, that inability to let go of what worked yesterday to embrace what would work tomorrow, cost them everything they had built. Nokia, the giant that froze. In 2007, Nokia wasn't just the leading mobile phone manufacturer, they were the mobile phone industry. They controlled roughly 40% of the global market. They sold more phones than all their competitors combined. In many countries, Nokia and mobile phone were synonymous. The brand was ubiquitous, trusted, dominant. The company's success was built on engineering excellence and operational efficiency. Their phones were reliable, durable, affordable. The famous phrase Nokia connecting people wasn't just marketing, it was reality. In developing markets, Nokia phones were often the first technology product families owned. They were tools of economic mobility, connection, progress. Nokia's Symbian operating system powered the smartphone revolution before most people knew what a smartphone was. The Nokia Communicator, released in the mid-90s, featured email, web browsing, office applications. It was a computer in your pocket years before that concept became mainstream. Nokia was ahead. They understood where mobile technology was heading, They had the talent, the resources, the market position to define that future. Then, in January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. It wasn't the first smartphone. Nokia had been making smartphones for years, but it was different. The entire interface was a touchscreen. No physical keyboard, no stylus, just your finger and glass. The operating system was fluid, intuitive, beautiful. Apps could be downloaded from a central store. Everything about it challenged conventional wisdom about what a phone should be. Nokia's leadership watched the iPhone launch and made a choice. They decided it wasn't a serious threat. The iPhone was expensive, over $600 without a contract. It only worked on one carrier. It had poor battery life. It couldn't send multimedia messages. It didn't support corporate email properly. By traditional metrics, it was incomplete, overpriced, limited. What Nokia missed was that none of those limitations mattered. The iPhone wasn't competing on features. It was competing on experience. It made people feel different when they used it. It made technology feel human, accessible, delightful. The limitations were temporary and fixable. The experience was revolutionary and sustainable. Nokia's response was confident dismissal. Their executives publicly questioned the iPhone's viability. They pointed out its flaws. They emphasized their own advantages in battery life, durability, global carrier relationships. They continued investing in Symbian, believing their existing platform just needed refinement, not replacement. This confidence was rooted in deep expertise. Nokia's engineers had spent decades perfecting mobile technology. They understood the constraints of battery life, processor power, network speeds. They knew what was technically possible and what wasn't. And based on that knowledge, the iPhone's approach seemed naive, wasteful, destined for a niche market. But expertise became blindness. Nokia's engineers couldn't imagine that consumers would accept the iPhone's compromises. Shorter battery life? Unacceptable. Fragile glass screen? Impractical. Expensive data plans? Prohibitive. They optimized for the constraints they knew and missed the new game being played. The game was ecosystem, not device. Apple understood something profound. The phone was becoming a platform. The value wasn't in the hardware specs. It was in the software, the apps, the content, the services. Apple built iTunes, the App Store, iCloud. They created a system where the phone was the entry point to an entire digital life. Nokia kept building phones. Very good phones. But just phones. They treated software as a supporting element, not the main event. Their App Store launched late and poorly. Their developer relations were weak. Their operating system updates were fragmented across different devices. They had all the pieces but couldn't assemble them into a coherent experience. By 2010, Nokia's market share was collapsing. The iPhone was taking the high end. Android phones from Samsung, HTC and others were flooding the mid-range. Nokia's Symbian platform felt ancient compared to iOS and Android. Their attempts to respond, the partnership with Microsoft, the Windows Phone strategy came too late and with too little conviction. In September 2013, Nokia sold their mobile phone division to Microsoft for just over $7 billion. At their peak, Nokia's market value exceeded $250 billion. They went from global dominance to irrelevance in under a decade. Not because they made bad phones. They made excellent phones until the very end. They failed because they defined the game too narrowly. The tragedy of Nokia is that they had everything they needed to win. They had more smartphone experience than Apple. They had better global distribution than Google. They had loyal customers who wanted them to succeed. But they were trapped by their own expertise, by their own success, by their own deeply rooted beliefs about what a phone should be. Nokia's engineers couldn't accept that consumers would choose a beautiful but flawed phone over a perfect but boring one. They couldn't imagine that the app ecosystem would matter more than battery life. They couldn't believe that their decades of mobile expertise would become irrelevant in a world where the phone was just a window to the internet. The company's leadership made several critical errors, but the foundational mistake was cultural. They built an organization optimized for incremental improvement in a world that had shifted to platform competition. They rewarded engineering excellence over user experience. They prioritized efficiency over innovation. They celebrated what they did well and ignored what the market was starting to value. There's a famous internal memo from Nokia's CEO, Stephen Elop, in 2011, where he compared the company to a man standing on a burning platform. The memo was supposed to inspire urgency, to shock the organization into action. But by then, it was already too late. The platform had been burning for years. They just hadn't noticed because the flames started small and grew slowly, then all at once. Nokia's fall demonstrates a painful truth. Deep expertise in yesterday's game can become a liability in tomorrow's game. The more you know about how things work, the harder it is to imagine them working differently. The more successful you've been with a particular approach, the more you resist approaches that contradict it. The very capabilities that built Nokia's dominance became cognitive anchors that prevented adaptation. Today, Nokia still exists. They're a successful telecommunications infrastructure company, building the networks that phones connect to rather than the phones themselves. It's a different business, profitable but much smaller than what they once were. The brand that once connected people is now mostly remembered as a cautionary tale about the speed of disruption and the cost of confidence. The lesson from Nokia is about the danger of being too good at what you do. Excellence creates certainty. Certainty creates rigidity. Rigidity creates vulnerability. The companies that survive aren't always the best at what exists. They're the ones willing to abandon what they do well to experiment with what might work better. Nokia knew the old rules perfectly. They just didn't realize the rules were changing. BlackBerry. The keyboard nobody wanted. If you were a professional in the mid-2000s, you probably owned a BlackBerry. Or you wanted one. Or you knew someone who couldn't stop checking theirs under the dinner table. The BlackBerry wasn't just a phone. It was a status symbol, a productivity tool, an addiction device. People called it the crackberry because the compulsion to check it was so strong. Research in Motion, the company behind BlackBerry, had created something genuinely revolutionary. Email on a phone, secure, fast, reliable mobile messaging, a physical, QWERTY keyboard that let you type without looking, push notifications that delivered messages instantly, the BlackBerry Enterprise server that made corporate IT departments comfortable. It was the perfect business tool designed by engineers for professionals. At its peak in 2009, BlackBerry had over 50 million users and 20% of the global smartphone market. The company was worth over $80 billion. Presidents, celebrities, executives, everyone who was anyone had a BlackBerry. The device defined mobile productivity. The keyboard was legendary. People could type full emails at remarkable speed, often without looking at the keys. Then the iPhone arrived and BlackBerry's leadership made the same mistake Nokia made. They dismissed it. The iPhone looked like a toy to them. No keyboard. How would professionals type? Consumer-focused. Businesses need security and management tools. Expensive. The corporate market can afford it, but why would they switch? Jim Balsillie and Mike Lazaridis, BlackBerry's co-CEOs, were confident their approach was superior. They had data supporting them. Typing tests showed that physical keyboards were faster and more accurate than touchscreens. Security audits demonstrated that BlackBerry's infrastructure was more robust than Apple's consumer-focused approach. Battery life comparisons favored BlackBerry. By every measurable metric they cared about, they were winning. But they were measuring the wrong things. The market wasn't choosing phones based on typing speed or battery life anymore. They're choosing based on experience, versatility, ecosystem. The iPhone could do email, but it could also browse the web beautifully, play music, show photos, run apps, play games. It was a computer in your pocket. BlackBerry was an email device with some additional features. Different category, different value proposition. BlackBerry's response to the iPhone and the rise of Android was to double down on their strengths. Better keyboards, better security, better email. They released the Bold, the Curve, the Torch. All good devices by their own criteria, all increasingly irrelevant in a market that had moved on. The fundamental error was philosophical. BlackBerry believed that professional users were a separate species from consumers. They built products for how people worked, not how people lived. They didn't understand that the same person checking work email wanted to browse Instagram, watch YouTube, play games, video chat with family. The line between work device and personal device was blurring, and BlackBerry was designing for a distinction that no longer existed. Their attempts to compete on touchscreen fell flat. The BlackBerry Storm, their first touchscreen device, was a disaster. The screen physically clicked when you pressed it, a bizarre hybrid of touch and physical feedback that pleased no one. Reviews were savage. Returns were high. It became a symbol of a company that didn't understand the new paradigm. BlackBerry's App Store, launched to compete with Apple's App Store and Google Play, was a ghost town. Developers didn't want to build for BlackBerry because the tools were difficult and the user base was shrinking. Users left BlackBerry because the apps they wanted weren't available. Classic death spiral. Less users meant fewer developers. Fewer developers meant worse app selection. Worse app selection meant more users leaving. The company tried pivoting to enterprise services, to messaging platforms, to software licensing. Nothing worked. The brand that had defined mobile email became associated with failure, with resistance to change, with clinging to the past. By 2016, BlackBerry stopped making phones entirely. Their last devices were sad, nostalgic throwbacks with physical keyboards that almost no one wanted. Research in Motion's market value collapsed from $80 billion to less than $3 billion in just a few years. The company that had invented mobile, email that had created the first true smartphone addiction, that had put the internet in everyone's pocket, was destroyed by its inability to let go of a keyboard. The BlackBerry story is particularly painful because their fundamental insight was correct. Mobile email mattered. Secure messaging mattered. Professional productivity mattered. They were right about what people needed. They just couldn't accept that the form factor, the keyboard they had perfected and believed was essential, was actually optional. This is a specific flavor of failure that we see repeatedly in these stories. Being right about the need but wrong about the solution. Understanding the problem but getting locked into one approach. BlackBerry correctly identified that professionals needed mobile productivity. They incorrectly assumed that required a physical keyboard. When the market proved them wrong, they couldn't adapt because their entire identity was built around that keyboard. The lesson from BlackBerry is about feature attachment. Companies fall in love with features, with attributes, with characteristics that defined their success. They can't imagine their product without those features, even when the market is clearly signaling that those features no longer matter or actively hurt the product. Today, BlackBerry still exists as a software and security company. They license their name to other manufacturers who make the occasional keyboard phone for the nostalgic niche. But the company that once defined mobile communication is a footnote, remembered mostly by people who miss the satisfying click of those perfect keys. The physical keyboard wasn't the problem. The attachment to it was. The inability to imagine a BlackBerry without a keyboard. The unwillingness to sacrifice what made them special, to pursue what the market wanted. The choice to serve their identity rather than their customers. That's what killed them. Excellence in one attribute doesn't guarantee survival. Sometimes, the thing you do best becomes the anchor that drowns you. Xerox PARC, inventing the future, missing the fortune. In the 1970s, the Xerox Corporation was printing money, literally. They dominated the photocopier market so completely that Xerox became a verb. Need to make copies? You Xeroxed them. They had near monopoly control, incredible margins, and a market position that seemed unshakable. With this wealth, Xerox made a remarkable decision. They would invest in the future. Not just incremental improvements to copiers, but fundamental research into computing, networking, human-computer interaction. They established the Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, and staffed it with the brightest minds they could find. Researchers from academia, innovative thinkers, people who could imagine computing beyond the mainframe. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary periods of innovation in technology history. Between 1970 and 1980, Xerox PARC invented the future, not metaphorically, literally invented, the technologies that would define personal computing for the next 5 decades. They created the graphical user interface, windows, icons, mouse pointer. Before PARC, computers used command lines, text input, cryptic instructions. PARC made computing visual. They invented the mouse as a practical input device. Not the first mouse ever built, but the first practical, usable version that could control a graphical interface. They developed Ethernet networking, the foundation for how computers communicate. They built the first laser printer, transforming how documents were created and distributed. They developed object-oriented programming concepts that would influence every major programming language. They created the first WYSIWYG word processor. What you see is what you get, meaning the screen showed exactly how the printed document would look. They built the Alto computer, the first personal computer with a graphical user interface, bitmap display and mouse. Look at your screen right now. The windows, the icons, the folders, the way you click and drag, all of it, every fundamental interaction pattern was invented at Xerox PARC. They didn't just improve computing, they reimagined it completely, and then Xerox did essentially nothing with it. This isn't an exaggeration. Xerox PARC created technologies that would be worth trillions of dollars across multiple companies, and Xerox captured almost none of that value. They invented the personal computer and let others commercialize it. They invented networking and watched Cisco become a giant. They invented laser printing, and while they did eventually sell printers, they missed the broader opportunity. The reasons for this failure are complex and organizational. Xerox's leadership didn't understand the technologies their researchers were creating. The distance between Palo Alto and Xerox headquarters in Connecticut wasn't just geographic. It was cultural. The researchers spoke a different language, thought in different timescales, valued different outcomes. Xerox's business was copiers, very profitable copiers. The company's incentive structures, promotion systems, resource allocation, everything was optimized for the copier. Business, personal computers, networking equipment. Those weren't copiers. They didn't fit the existing sales model. the existing customer relationships, the existing anything. The most famous moment in this failure occurred in 1979. Xerox, attempting to build relationships with smaller tech companies, arranged for Apple to visit PARC. Steve Jobs and a small team came to see what the researchers were working on. In exchange, Xerox received the option to buy Apple stock, 100,000 shares at pre-IPO prices. The PARC researchers demonstrated the Alto computer, graphical interface, mouse, windows, icons, everything that would later appear in the Macintosh and define personal computing. Steve Jobs watched the demonstration and, by multiple accounts, became extremely excited. He saw immediately what this meant, not as research, as product, as the future of computing. Jobs later said, "They showed me 3 things. I was so blinded by the first one I didn't even see the other 2. He wasn't talking about being confused. He was talking about being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was seeing. This was the future, and Xerox was sitting on it. Apple went back to Cupertino and began developing what would become the Lisa and later the Macintosh, both built around the PARC concepts. Microsoft saw the Mac and built Windows. The entire personal computer revolution that created trillions in market value can be traced directly to technologies invented at Xerox PARC. Xerox received their 100,000 shares of Apple. At the IPO, those shares were worth about $17 million, a decent return, but trivial compared to what they had given away. They traded the foundational technologies of personal computing for a small stake in one company that would use those technologies. This wasn't theft. Some have called it that, but the legal and ethical reality is more complex. Xerox showed their work to Apple voluntarily. They had opportunities to commercialize it themselves. They simply didn't see the value. Or more accurately, they saw value, but not enough to justify the disruption to their core business. This is the pattern that makes the Xerox story different from the others. They didn't miss the future because they were blind to it. They invented it. They funded it. They had the best seat at the table, and they still missed it because seeing and capturing are different things. Xerox's failure reveals a profound organizational problem. Large companies can fund research. They can hire brilliant people. They can create environments where innovation flourishes, but they often struggle to commercialize radical innovation because radical innovation threatens existing business models. The researcher at PARC who invented laser printing was told that his invention might cannibalize copier sales. The graphical interface threatened the mainframe business model. Networking challenged the centralized computing approach that corporate customers preferred. Every major PARC invention, from the perspective of Xerox's existing business, looked like risk, not opportunity. There's a psychological phenomenon at play here. When you're successful, you develop strong beliefs about why you're successful. Xerox believed they were successful because they understood office workflow, corporate sales, hardware manufacturing. Personal computers didn't fit that story. So even when their own researchers demonstrated the future, leadership couldn't integrate it into their worldview. The other companies that won, Apple, Microsoft, Cisco, they weren't better technologists than Xerox. They were better at seeing commercialization opportunities. They understood that these technologies weren't research projects. They were products waiting to be built and sold. They had organizational structures that could move from idea to market quickly. Xerox eventually did try to commercialize some PARC technologies. The Xerox Star, released in 1981, was a commercial version of the Alto. It had the graphical interface, the mouse, networking. It was years ahead of anything else on the market. It was also priced at $75,000, marketed to corporations and positioned as a specialized office system rather than a general-purpose computer, the Star sold poorly. Not because it was bad, but because Xerox couldn't escape their own DNA. They built it like a copier, expensive, specialized, sold to corporate purchasing departments. Apple built the Mac for individuals, for creativity, for education. Different mindset, different outcome. Today, Xerox PARC still exists now as an independent research company. They continue doing innovative work, but the parent company, Xerox Corporation, is a fraction of its former size. The copier business that seemed so stable was itself disrupted by digital transformation. The company that invented the technologies that would make paper documents obsolete couldn't imagine a world beyond photocopiers. The lesson from Xerox PARC is perhaps the most painful of all these stories. You can be first, you can be right, you can invent the future, and you can still lose everything if you can't commercialize what you create. Innovation without execution is just expensive research. The saddest part isn't what Xerox lost, it's what they had. They held the future in their hands, not predictions, not guesses, actual working prototypes of technologies that would change everything. And they let it slip away because it didn't fit their quarterly targets, their sales model, their understanding of their own business. In the end, Xerox PARC's inventions didn't fail. Xerox failed the inventions. They created tomorrow and chose to live in yesterday. And that choice, repeated in 1,000 small decisions across a decade, cost them the future they had built. Yahoo, the search engine that refused to search. In the late 1990s, Yahoo was the internet. If you wanted to go online, you started at Yahoo. Their homepage was a directory of websites, carefully categorized by human editors. Search, email, news, chat, groups, everything you did online probably touched Yahoo in some way. The company was valued at over $100 billion at the peak of the dot-com bubble. They were the gateway to the web, the most visited site, the defining brand of the internet era. Their exclamation point, Yahoo, wasn't just punctuation, it was attitude. The internet was exciting, new, full of possibility, and Yahoo was your guide. But Yahoo's core business model was fragile. They made money from advertising, but they didn't create content. They organized other people's content. Their value was curation, making the chaos of the early web navigable. As the web grew, that model became increasingly difficult to sustain. In 1998, two Stanford graduate students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin had developed a new search technology. They called it Backrub, later renamed Google. Their algorithm, PageRank, worked differently than existing search engines. Instead of just matching keywords, it analyzed the link structure of the web, using links as votes of quality and relevance. The results were noticeably better than anything else available. Searches returned more relevant results. The interface was cleaner, faster, simpler, just a search box and two buttons, nothing else. While Yahoo's homepage was cluttered with links, news, ads, Google's was almost empty. The difference wasn't just aesthetic, it was philosophical. Page and Brin tried to sell their search technology. They were graduate students, not business people. They wanted to finish their degrees, not run a company. They approached Yahoo, among others, with an offer. $1 million for the PageRank algorithm and the search technology. Yahoo said no. Not because they didn't recognize that Google's search was better, they did. But Yahoo's leadership believed search wasn't important. Their business model was built around being a portal, keeping users on Yahoo properties as long as possible, showing them ads, keeping them in the Yahoo ecosystem. Good search would send users away to other websites. Bad business. This is one of the most profound misunderstandings of user behavior in internet history. Yahoo believed their value was in retention, keeping eyeballs on their properties. Google understood that value was in utility. If you helped users find what they wanted quickly, they'd come back. Not because you trapped them, but because you served them. Yahoo continued using other companies' search technology, licensing it rather than building or buying their own. Meanwhile, Google raised venture capital and launched as an independent company in 1998. Their growth was explosive. Users loved how fast and accurate the search was. The clean interface felt revolutionary compared to cluttered portals. By 2002, it was clear Google was winning search. Yahoo had another opportunity. Google had grown but was still small enough to acquire. The price had gone up considerably, no longer $1 million. Now it would cost around $3 billion. Still, Yahoo could afford it. They had the cash, and Google was clearly the future of search. Yahoo's CEO at the time considered it. There were serious discussions, but ultimately Yahoo passed. Again. Not because $3 billion was too expensive, but because they still didn't believe search was their core business. They were a media company, a content company, a destination. Google was utility. Different categories in their mental model. So Yahoo built their own search technology instead. They acquired several companies, Inktomi, AltaVista, All the Web, all with search technology. They integrated them into Yahoo Search, launched in 2004. It was competitive. Not as good as Google, but good enough. If they had done this in 1998, they might have kept their lead, but it was too late. Google had the momentum. More importantly, Google had understood something deeper than search algorithms. They understood that search was the pivot point of the entire internet. If you controlled how people found information, you control access to everything else. Search wasn't a feature, it was the organizing principle of the web. Google's business model, simple text ads matched to search queries, proved wildly profitable. More profitable than banner ads. More scalable than Yahoo's complex ecosystem of properties. Google got paid every time someone searched, and people searched billions of times per day. Yahoo had one more chance. In 2006, they tried to buy Facebook for $1 billion. The deal was negotiated. Mark Zuckerberg had agreed. Then Yahoo's stock price dropped, and they revised the offer down to $850 million. Zuckerberg walked away. Today, Facebook is worth over $800 billion. Then, in 2008, Microsoft offered to buy Yahoo for $44 billion. Yahoo's board rejected it, believing they were worth more. They weren't. Yahoo's value continued declining. They never received another offer close to that amount. By 2016, Yahoo was sold to Verizon for less than $5 billion. From a $100 billion valuation to less than $5 billion in less than 2 decades. The company that had defined the internet became a cautionary tale about missing every major opportunity in a rapidly evolving market. Yahoo's failures weren't about technology. They had talented engineers, they had resources, they had market position. Their failures were strategic. They misunderstood their own business. They thought they were a media company when they were a technology company. They thought retention mattered more than utility. They thought they could build everything themselves rather than acquire the best. But the deepest failure was pattern recognition. Yahoo had 2 clear chances to buy Google, once for $1 million, once for $3 billion. They missed both. They had a chance to buy Facebook. They negotiated poorly and lost it. They had a chance to sell to Microsoft at a fair price. They overvalued themselves and refused. Each individual decision might seem defensible, but the pattern reveals a company that consistently misjudged value, both their own and that of emerging competitors. They didn't see that the internet was shifting from destination portals to utility platforms. They didn't understand that search and social would become more valuable than media and content. The lesson from Yahoo is about identity confusion. If you don't understand what business you're really in, you can't make good strategic decisions. Yahoo thought they were in the media business. They were actually in the attention business. Media companies create content, attention companies create distribution. Very different skills, very different strategies. Google knew they were in the attention business. Facebook knew it too. They built platforms that distributed other people's content and captured value through that distribution. Yahoo kept trying to create their own content, their own properties, their own ecosystem. They played the wrong game. Today, Yahoo exists mostly as a brand licensed to various companies for email and news services. The company that could have owned search and social networking, that had opportunities to acquire both Google and Facebook, ended up as a footnote in internet history. The cost of those missed opportunities wasn't just the acquisition prices, it was leadership of the internet itself. Yahoo could have been Google and Facebook combined. Instead, they're an answer to a trivia question about corporate failure. MySpace, the social network that forgot about users. In 2005, MySpace was the social network, not just the biggest, the only one that mattered. They had over 100 million users when Facebook was still limited to college students. MySpace was where musicians promoted their work, where teenagers customized their profiles with glittery backgrounds and auto-playing music, where Tom was everyone's first friend. The site represented a particular vision of social networking: freedom, customization, expression. Your MySpace page could be whatever you wanted. HTML and CSS allowed complete control over appearance. It was chaotic, sometimes ugly, but deeply personal. Every page was different, reflecting individual taste, creativity, identity. News Corporation, Rupert Murdoch's media empire, bought MySpace in 2005 for $580 million. At the time, it seemed like a smart acquisition. Social networking was clearly important. MySpace was the leader. $580 million was a lot of money, but the growth trajectory suggested it was worth it. Then News Corporation began managing MySpace like a media property, because that's what media companies do. They optimized for advertising revenue. They cluttered pages with ads. They made deals with advertisers that degraded user experience. They prioritized short-term revenue over long-term growth. The site became slower, more bloated. Profile pages which users had carefully customized could take 30 seconds to load because of advertising scripts, tracking code, and media company overhead. The once simple experience of browsing friends' pages became an exercise in patience. Meanwhile, Facebook was taking a different approach. Mark Zuckerberg had learned from MySpace's mistakes. Facebook's design was clean, consistent, fast. No customization meant no chaos. Profiles loaded instantly. The interface was predictable. It felt professional where MySpace felt messy. Facebook also made smarter technical decisions. They built infrastructure that scaled efficiently. They hired talented engineers and gave them resources to solve hard problems. They treated technology as core to their business, not as a cost center supporting an advertising business. MySpace, under News Corporation's ownership, treated technology as support staff. Engineering budgets were constrained. Talented developers left for companies that valued their work. Technical debt accumulated. The codebase became increasingly difficult to maintain and improve. But the fatal error wasn't technical, it was strategic. News Corporation didn't understand that social networks live or die based on user experience. Every decision that prioritized advertisers over users made MySpace slightly less appealing. Individually, none of these decisions seemed catastrophic. Collectively, they were fatal. The network effect that had built MySpace began working in reverse. As Facebook improved and MySpace degraded, the balance tipped. Cool people migrated to Facebook. Once the cool people left, everyone else followed. Not overnight, gradually, but unstoppably. By 2008, Facebook had overtaken MySpace in user numbers. By 2010, MySpace was a digital ghost town. The same pages that once hosted vibrant communities sat abandoned, digital ruins with broken image links and silent music players. News Corporation sold MySpace in 2011 for $35 million. They had bought it for $580 million. In 6 years, they destroyed over $500 million in value. Not through malice, but through misunderstanding what business they were in. MySpace's story is particularly instructive because their initial advantage was enormous. They had the users, the brand recognition, the cultural moment. Bands were sharing their music on MySpace. Comedians were building audiences. Artists were showcasing their work. The platform had become culturally significant in a way Facebook hadn't yet. But they made the classic mistake of optimizing for what they could measure easily, advertising revenue, at the expense of what was harder to measure, user satisfaction. Each quarter they could report ad revenue growth, but they didn't have good metrics for tracking the gradual degradation of user experience, the slight increase in frustration every time a page took longer to load. The lesson from MySpace is about who you serve first. In a two-sided marketplace, platforms that serve advertisers first eventually lose users. Platforms that serve users first eventually get advertisers. MySpace chose the advertisers. Facebook chose the users. The outcome was predictable. There's also a lesson here about corporate culture clash. News Corporation was a media company built on controlling content and selling advertising. MySpace was a technology platform built on enabling user-generated content and facilitating connections. These are fundamentally different businesses requiring different skills, different metrics, different instincts. When News Corporation tried to run MySpace like a media property, they destroyed what made it valuable. They tried to control and monetize when they should have been facilitating and scaling. They focused on short-term revenue extraction when they should have been focused on long-term platform growth. The tragedy is that MySpace could see Facebook growing. They weren't blind to the competition, but organizational inertia, quarterly earnings pressures, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the business prevented them from responding effectively. By the time they realized the magnitude of the threat, it was too late. Today, MySpace is barely a footnote in internet history, a name that evokes nostalgia for a certain era of the internet but has no ongoing relevance. The platform that introduced a generation to social networking, that launched musical careers, that defined online identity for millions, is gone. Not because they were first and someone built something better, because they had it and gave it away, one bad decision at a time. Toys R Us, the partner that became a predator. In 2000, Toys R Us was struggling with a problem. They wanted to sell toys online, but building an e-commerce platform was expensive and complex. They had tried building their own website and it had been a disaster. Poor inventory management, fulfillment problems, customer service issues, online retail was harder than it looked. Then they found what seemed like a perfect solution: Amazon. The company was still primarily a bookseller, but they had e-commerce infrastructure, warehouses, shipping capabilities, website technology. everything Toys R Us needed. So they made a deal. The partnership seemed brilliant for both sides. Toys R Us would be the exclusive toy seller on Amazon for 10 years. Amazon would handle all the technology, logistics, and customer service. Toys R Us would provide the inventory and toy expertise. Together they would dominate online toy sales. Toys R Us paid Amazon $285 million over the life of the partnership. They committed to buying at least minimum amounts of inventory. They essentially outsourced their entire online presence to a partner. For a traditional retail company uncertain about technology, it seemed like a smart risk mitigation strategy. For a few years, it worked. Toys R Us got an online presence without the capital investment and operational headaches. Amazon got guaranteed revenue and valuable data about toy sales, seasonal patterns, customer preferences. Win-win. Then Amazon started learning. They learned which toys sold well. They learned about seasonal patterns. They learned about pricing strategies, about inventory management, about everything Toys R Us knew about selling toys. They were getting paid to go to school on someone else's expertise. And then, according to Toys R Us, Amazon started breaking the exclusivity agreement. They allowed other toy sellers on the platform. They started selling toys directly. They used the knowledge they'd gained from the partnership to compete with their partner. Toys Us sued in 2004, claiming breach of contract. The lawsuit dragged on. Meanwhile, Amazon was building a toy business using everything they'd learned. By the time the court ruled in Toys R Us's favor in 2006, the damage was done. Toys R Us regained the right to sell toys on other platforms, but they had lost precious years. They had taught Amazon how to sell toys. They had missed the critical early years of online retail when they could have been building their own capabilities, their own customer relationships, their own platform. The partnership also had a more subtle cost. While Toys R Us outsourced online, they underinvested in digital capabilities. They didn't build internal expertise in e-commerce, in digital marketing, in online customer service. They remained dependent on partnerships in an industry where digital competency was becoming essential for survival. By the time Toys R Us ended the Amazon partnership and tried to build their own e-commerce presence, they were years behind. Amazon knew more about selling toys online than they did, and Amazon had used that knowledge to build a massive toy business. Toys R Us struggled for another decade, burdened by debt from a leveraged buyout, unable to compete effectively online, watching their once dominant position erode. They filed for bankruptcy in 2017. By 2018, all US stores were closed. The company that had defined toy retail for generations was gone. The Amazon partnership wasn't the only reason Toys R Us failed. The leveraged buyout that saddled them with billions in debt was arguably more damaging. But the Amazon deal exemplifies a particular type of strategic error, outsourcing core competency to a potential competitor. In 2000, Toys R Us leadership believed that selling toys was their core competency, and e-commerce was just a distribution channel. They were wrong. The core competency of retail was shifting from product selection to customer relationships, from physical presence to digital capability. By outsourcing online, they outsourced their future. Amazon understood this. They didn't just want to provide infrastructure. They wanted to learn retail from successful retailers. The Toys R Us partnership was a masterclass in toy retail. Amazon was a talented student, and once they had learned enough, they no longer needed the teacher. The lesson from Toys R Us is about partnership risk. When you partner with someone who could become a competitor, You need to be extremely careful about what you're teaching them and what dependencies you're creating. If the partnership gives them everything they need to compete with you, it's not a partnership. It's a transfer of knowledge and market position. Toys are. Us could have used the Amazon partnership differently. They could have treated it as a temporary solution while building their own capabilities. They could have hired engineers, invested in technology, learned e-commerce while Amazon handled the execution. Instead, they treated it as a permanent outsourcing solution and stopped worrying about online retail. The other lesson is about core competency redefinition. What you believe is core to your business might be changing. Toys are. Us thought their core was toy merchandising. They were right for the physical retail era. But in the digital era, the core became customer data, logistics, technology, platform. By the time they realized this, Amazon had built insurmountable leads in all those areas. Today, Amazon sells tens of billions of dollars worth of toys annually. They're the largest toy retailer in America, maybe the world. They built that business partly on knowledge transferred to them by Toys R Us through a partnership that was supposed to help the toy retailer compete online. It's one of business history's most ironic reversals. The established giant hired the emerging platform to handle their online sales. The emerging platform learned everything the giant knew. Then the platform used that knowledge to destroy the giant and take their market. Toys are. Us didn't just lose to Amazon. They trained Amazon to beat them, and they paid $285 million for the privilege. As you drift towards sleep, let's step back from the specific stories and look at the patterns. Because these aren't isolated incidents, they're symptoms of the same underlying disease, a disease that infects successful organizations, slowly at first, then catastrophically. The pattern starts with success. A company finds a profitable model. They execute well. They grow. They dominate. The market rewards them with profits, growth, status. Everyone celebrates the winning formula. This formula becomes gospel. The beliefs that drove success become assumptions about how the world works. Then the world changes. Technology shifts. Customer preferences evolve. New competitors appear. The change starts small. A startup nobody's heard of, a technology that seems like a toy, a business model that doesn't make sense by traditional metrics. The early signals are easy to dismiss, and successful companies do dismiss them, because they're busy, because they're focused on quarterly earnings, because their existing business is demanding, because their organizational structure is built to optimize the current model, not explore alternatives, because changing course feels risky when the current course is still profitable. This is where the trap closes. The very success that built the company creates the blindness that destroys it. Profitability funds comfort. Comfort breeds resistance to change. Resistance to change creates vulnerability. Vulnerability invites disruption. Every company in tonight's story saw the threat. Kodak invented digital photography. Blockbuster knew about Netflix. Nokia watched the iPhone launch. BlackBerry saw touch screens. Xerox invented personal computing. Yahoo could have bought Google. MySpace watched Facebook grow. Toys R Us partnered with Amazon. None were blind. All saw it coming. What they couldn't do was respond effectively, because effective response requires sacrificing what's working for what might work better. It requires internal disruption. It requires organizational courage. It requires admitting that the formula that brought success might not be the formula that maintains it. This is emotionally and organizationally brutal. Leaders built careers on the current model. Employees developed expertise in current processes. Shareholders expect continued returns from current operations. The entire organizational ecosystem is optimized for now, not next. Changing requires convincing everyone to abandon certainty for uncertainty, to sacrifice visible profits for invisible potential, to trade the comfort of expertise for the discomfort of learning. Most organizations can't make this trade, not because they're stupid, but because they're successful, and success creates its own gravitational pull. There's also a timing problem. When do you disrupt yourself? Too early and you destroy profitable businesses before the replacement is ready. Too late and competitors have taken the new market. The window for self-disruption is narrow and hard to identify in real time. Kodak waited too long and gave the digital camera market to Sony and Canon. But if they'd moved aggressively in the 1980s, they might have destroyed their film business before digital was viable. The timing of these transitions is genuinely difficult, but this difficulty isn't an excuse for inaction. It's a challenge that requires conscious strategy. The companies that survive disruption don't get the timing perfect. They get it approximately right and compensate for timing uncertainty with aggressive execution. The successful adapters, the companies that survive transitions, share certain characteristics. They maintain paranoia even when successful. They invest in projects that might cannibalize existing business. They promote leaders who challenge conventional wisdom. They measure different things than just quarterly earnings. Apple almost died in the 90s and came back by disrupting themselves repeatedly. iPod cannibalized music players they didn't even make. iPhone cannibalized the iPod. iPad cannibalized low-end laptops. Each transition destroyed something profitable to build something more valuable. Microsoft missed mobile but survived by pivoting to cloud services, even though it meant de-emphasizing Windows, the product that had defined the company. Netflix destroyed their own DVD business to build streaming. Amazon constantly launches businesses that compete with their existing ones. These companies internalized a crucial lesson. The greatest threat isn't external competition, it's internal complacency. It's the quiet belief that today's success guarantees tomorrow's relevance. It's the assumption that the market will wait for you to be ready to change. The market doesn't wait. Technology doesn't pause. Customers don't stay loyal to business models they no longer need. The distance between dominance and irrelevance is shorter than any of these companies imagined. Kodak went from 90% market share to bankruptcy in 20 years. Nokia went from 40% to single digits in less than a decade. This speed of collapse is accelerating. The half-life of companies is shorter than it's ever been. The tenure of companies on the S&P 500 is shrinking. The advantage of being first or being biggest is eroding. What matters now is being adaptive, being willing to transform, being comfortable with continuous reinvention. As you settle into sleep tonight, carrying these stories with you, remember this. Every company that failed tonight was once as powerful as today's giants. Every single one believed they were different, protected, too big to fail. Every single one had intelligent leaders, talented employees, loyal customers. None of it mattered when the ground shifted and they didn't shift with it. The business landscape is littered with the graves of companies that were too successful to change. That believed their advantages were permanent. That confused yesterday's victories with tomorrow's strategies. That optimized for comfort instead of survival. The cost of these mistakes wasn't just measured in billions of lost market value, though that's staggering. It was measured in lives disrupted, careers destroyed, communities hollowed out. When Kodak collapsed, Rochester, New York, lost its economic engine. When Blockbuster failed, thousands of retail workers lost jobs. When Nokia fell, entire Finnish communities suffered. These stories matter because they're not history. They're warnings. Right now, companies are making the same mistakes. Different technologies, different markets, same fundamental errors. Choosing comfort over adaptation. Defending the past instead of building the future. Believing their current position is permanent. The most expensive mistake in business history is the belief that success is a destination rather than a journey. That once you win, you can relax. That dominance protects against disruption. That the rules that brought you success are the rules that will keep you successful. Success is temporary. Advantage is fragile. Dominance is an invitation to disruption. The only sustainable strategy is continuous transformation. The only safe position is relentless paranoia. The only protection is the willingness to destroy what you built before someone else does it for you. These billion-dollar lessons are yours now, bought with the failure of giants, written in the ruins of companies that seemed immortal. They cost enormous amounts of money, jobs, and economic value to learn, but the tuition has been paid by those who came before. The question is whether we'll learn. Whether today's leaders will look at these stories and see warnings rather than ancient history. Whether organizations will choose uncomfortable transformation over comfortable stagnation. Whether we'll remember that the graveyard of business is filled with companies that were too big to fail, until they failed. As your breathing slows and sleep arrives, let these stories settle into your consciousness. Not as entertainment, but as instruction, as reminders that nothing is permanent, that vigilance matters more than dominance, that the willingness to change is more valuable than the ability to succeed. The future belongs to those who build it, not those who defend what they built. Yesterday, good night.